So again, I'm Byron Belitsos, and this talk is based on my master's thesis at Union Theological Seminary entitled Integral Theodicy, which Father Roger Haight was the primary reader for it, and I'm grateful to him for plowing through it. It's 200 pages, and now I've got it down to 3 pages to present it to you in capsule summary. I haven't done this before, so bear with me. I've done a kind of a digest of the key ideas. I'm going to kind of quasi-read this to you, and I'm going to watch your facial expressions and see if I'm getting anything across. I'd like to go a few minutes here before we have any commentary or any questions or comments. And I'm wondering, Fran, we have a half hour exactly, right?
Yes.
So we'll break it into a kind of a first part of a kind of a informal lecture, if you will. Since I've spent 2 years on this, I want to get a few things across, and then move to just discussion and some questions. So here we go. So really, the subject is the issue of evil and sin, and in particular, the theological apprehension of that we call theodicy, which is defined as the defense of God's goodness in the face of pervasive evil. So it sounds kind of daunting, and it is daunting. And it really had not I don't think a very strong philosophic critique until we come to David Hume in the 18th century, the philosopher, the skeptic, who said that, we got 3 incompatible propositions in Christian thought, which is God is all powerful, God is loving, and yet God allows evil and sin to pervade our experience. So how can we make these 3 things logically able to coexist? And how is it even coherent to think of God as all powerful, absolutely loving, and yet allowing us to have suffering, sin, evil, and iniquity? The Christians have always faced this kind of challenge, but not as explicitly as in this formula. And it makes this into a pretty precarious discipline that I've chosen to get into. And now you're with me for a few minutes to kind of dive in. So, I mean, a theodicy really has to support our faith, if we are people of faith, that God is sovereign, that God is all loving, and somehow we have to wrestle with the injustice, oppression, racism, and warfare in the world. How do we do that? And, the church fathers had a theology of salvation from sin and the defeat of what they call the God of this world through the cross. They spelled this out in church councils, and then they took refuge later in a kind of epistemic humility, you might say, which we can call apophatic theology. So in patristic thought, there isn't a necessarily philosophic, rational coherence about the problem of evil. It kind of ends with paradoxical mystery. And so we find that more in the Eastern Christian church, but in the West, it's a little bit more rationalistic, and there's more of a push with Aquinas and others to come up with an explanation of evil and a definition of evil, and setting aside mysticism for the most part and paradox for the most part. And then we come up to the modern era, where in a way the problem is even worse, particularly in the post-Holocaust era, in post-World War I, World War II, Hiroshima, the Holocaust, genocide. So in a way we can say the problem's even bigger problem, and that we have a huge planetary crisis where there are all sorts of maladies that we're facing, including horrendous evils, and actually seemingly purposeful iniquitous behavior on the part of some parties that you can easily identify, things like Well, we won't even go into that. We know what these things are, most of us. Um, so I'm going to do a little history, real quick history. So with St. Augustine, we have a genius who came up with a theodicy which grounds the problem in the misuse of free will. And Augustine traces the presence of evil to Adam, and even before that to fallen angels. And so for him, evil was only on the side of creaturely perversion by the creature, by angels, by Adam, by humans. And so evil was not God's doing in any way, in any sense. It was something unreal, because everything God touches is good, and evil is not real. It has no being. So evil is only present by subtraction from being, from goodness. So evil's not really real. And so we have to say that sin and evil is a lack of goodness. It's privation of goodness. It really doesn't exist in this sense. I personally, prefer a more realistic view, according to which we focus on the relative reality of evil. We focus not so much on this abstraction, but on the evildoer being a perpetrator who has some being, in the sense that they not only lack something, but there's a kind of an illness in their being. And that's more of a Eastern Orthodox view, you might say. So this kind of illness, if you will, is in the Eastern Orthodox way, the way I was brought up, is a perversion of the project of our growth toward God. So there's a project of deification or divinization. And so in this quest, we can become evil through doing it by our own will, rather than in a kind of relationship to divine grace. So there's a dialectic of our choices and divine grace. This is one of the big sort of premises of traditional theodicy. The other is what's known as the greater goods justification of God's goodness. And that is that God allows evil for another reason, other than for the fact that he allows us to make these mistakes. He also he harvests evil for good, and he harvests the sins of the evildoers because there's an unseen divine purpose behind it. So the universe is a better place, said St. Augustine, with sin than it would have been without it. And this model, as you may know, was adapted by Luther, Calvin, and in the Reformation in a more of a stark way. And they saw human will as shackled by sin, by original sin. And with St. Augustine, they thought that we can only be saved by unearned acts of divine grace that are ultimately predestined, according to Calvin. But the idea here in this theodicy is that God creates greater goods from evil deeds through providence, through his providence. So now a quick transition to the modern view. And if you kind of bear with me a bit more on this, the pre-modern view was one of devolution, really, for fall from paradise into sin, and into a state where we need grace. But the modern discovery of evolution, as you know, challenges that model, of course. So instead of a devolution, we have an evolution. And the question becomes, how can a transcendent God, who's outside of time and space, mitigate evil in the context of an evolving universe? And so I identify three key answers to this modernist theological frame, which number one is the the so-called soul-making approach to the problem of evil. And second is the process theodicy. And thirdly is Hegel's evolutionary theism. Now we're going to set aside Hegel and focus on the first two. So the first one is John Hick's idea that evil is present so that we can grow our souls. So it's known as the soul-making theodicy. And we, rather than, this backward going, the state of, that we don't look back to a state of perfection, we're looking forward to the possibility of perfection through soul evolution. And we begin in this life when we continue into the afterlife. And in the afterlife, we achieve healing and perfection. And this destiny that we have justifies evil and sin, this long travail that is the soul-making process. And that leaves aside the possibility of what we'll come back to. It's called dysteleological evil, which is evil and sin which can't possibly be converted into anything conceivably good. The second of these two is the highly influential process theodicy, which says that God is not all powerful and that there is a real battle between the divine and the demonic. This is a real battle, and the outcome is not guaranteed. The outcome is not decided. And so there's no happy ending here other than human courage and human decision-making in partnership with the divine. The divine is not able to do this without us, and we may fail. And so the struggle of evil is not controlled from above, doesn't have any guaranteed ending. And therefore we cannot be complacent about evil because it may serve the selfish interests of the powerful. So God alone cannot convert evil to good outcomes. God is a partner with us in a kind of acts of heroism and courage and co-creatorship. So, these are two solutions that are modern or postmodern, and they're based on evolutionary theism, as I would call it. To conclude, this part of it, this history, is that we have one remaining issue, which I mentioned before. It's dysteleological evil, which is also known as horrendous evil. I think of it as iniquitous evil, which we cannot conceive of any possible way to harvest good from it. And such iniquitous perpetrations leave behind hapless victims. And it's nearly impossible to think about how this is converted to good over time in any way. And so this leads to the insight that we have no solution to the problem of evil. So I'm going to stop there and invite some comments, and then I have a couple of slides to show you, which we'll conclude with, but I'm open to your comments and questions. So let me put it.
I could start, Byron, if unless we're using the raised hands switch.
No, go for it, Bill.
You mentioned John Hick's. Which book title, with regard to his hypothesis of theodicy, would you be referring to?
It's Evil in the God of Love, his foundational text. Yeah, and he went beyond that later, as you may know. But it's a kind of a perennial idea of through struggle we gain soul evolution and growth and personal growth. And I like often to convert that into an Eastern Orthodox view of the divinization process. But what John Hick does is give us a deep philosophic grasp of why this is a far better model than the traditional model, which is really one that's where we're dependent on grace and we're helpless. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
You bet. Unless we have further, I'll just jump right into these slides, which I think will be provocative. And so the first of these, is this this slide. Can you see this? It says elements of an integrative theodicy.
Yes.
This is a huge summation, and let's run through it. So we think of evil as the lack of goodness, which is in a way obvious. And this is St. Augustine's view, and we need to update that. And a lot of work has been done on this idea of the evil, that the evil is not really real. It's actually just a lack of the good. And evil is present because God allows us to have free will. So the second is, as I mentioned, is God's production of greater goods. So God allows the destruction of evil and sin, this which is apparent and transient, because there's going to be a harvest of greater good. So you could even look at something like World War II and say, well, what greater goods came out of World War II? Well, we formed the United Nations. We got the Declaration of Human Rights. We got the Constitution of the United Nations from that. We got international law was created. The Nuremberg Principles were created from World War II. So you can think of greater goods in that way. And there was, a great deal of reflection that on violence and on foreign policy, and the very much better ideas came out of World War II than preceded World War II about how to solve the problem of war. So you might say that's a production of greater goods, but you might really question that too when you look at something like Hiroshima. Thirdly, again, in the elements of an integrative theology, I really think soul making is central, and the notion that, especially in the afterlife, whatever suffering, whatever evils befell us in this life, some horrendous situation like Hiroshima, you will heal the wounds of that in the afterlife in a healing process that goes on forever. Fourth is something I coined as meta theodicy. This is the notion that we can somehow conceive of a multiverse in which there is an evolutionary realm and there's an eternal realm. There's deity in the eternal realm, and there's evolutionary deity in the evolving space-time realms. So a meta theodicy is working with both dimensions. Fifth here is something unique to David Ray Griffin's understanding, and something that I've worked on myself, is that the demonic is to be understood not as a person, demonic persons, the devil or Lucifer, but as an evolutionary field effect of evil actions. So Griffin thinks of it as kind of a quasi soul, but a negative soul, that actually is a field that it pervades the planet and allows perpetrators to kind of pull from this energy, this dark energy, so to speak. And it's fairly elaborate in his later writings, David Ray Griffin, the great process theologian. Sixth here is the element of apophasis, or epistemic humility, which is, I think, the best way for us to regard, the ravages of something like Hiroshima. We cannot explain this, and we should not expect an explanation that's rational. However, we can't just say it's irrational. We might say it's transrational, and something that we take into our prayer life, into our mystical contemplation, albeit this is not a very pleasant one, but I think it's very important for Christians to turn this over to the divine and ask for resolution of the paradox of how an all-powerful God can permit horrendous evil. And finally, something I call the subtle gradations of evil and good, which is essential in this because, today we have an evolutionary worldview. So we need to not just think of this anywhere like the traditional view as the fall of man, but rather the ascent of humankind, or the possibility of descent at any point in the ascent. And to help with that, I've created yet another chart here. I hope you can see this chart, which has many elements. I'm going to run through it quickly, not too quickly though. That to get a handle on this, I created this because what I found in Christian thought is the problem of a conflation of evil and sin too often, where there's not enough distinction of gradations. And here I introduce 5 gradations of sort of what you might call a chart of moral turpitude. So gradations of morality. So the first top here in this area here is not even moral. So these are accidents, and accidents, according to some Christians, are a visitation from God. Like, in Calvinism, if a sparrow falls from the sky, God is aware of this, as Jesus says. God is aware of all things, but it goes a little further in Calvin where God causes this to happen. So here we want to remove this notion of omni-causal understanding. Just say these are pure accidents. There really are accidents. Not everything that happens has a reason. It's just purely random. So we get into morality when we get to the first step here, which is error, where the next gradation here is just people making mistakes. And these are poor choices that we make, really as children, or that we're immature, or that we're just narrow, we're ignorant, we're uneducated. So this may appear to some perspective to be evil, but you should really assign it to just error. Evil comes in, not in the way, in my view, not in the way used in Christian theology so much as conflated with sin, but evil I would define as just deeply confused or conflicted and lacking an understanding of moral values, and sometimes just being reckless or in stress. And but an evil person, according to my definition, can be repentant, and they can have remorse. So at this level, you can repent because you're confused, or you may be tempted by self-interest. But those who are deeply tempted by self-interest, we should call sinners, who are deliberately going against recognized values. They're really perpetrating. They're causing harm, and at some level they know it. And if we interview them, we'll find that they're insincere. A sinner will rationalize, will give excuses, won't really give a clear definition of what their acts are for, and but there's an agenda. There's a selfish agenda behind it. And we find with sin that repentance is difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. We also, this shades into addiction, right? So any kind of addiction, gambling addiction, sex addiction, these are habits of sin that are very difficult to repent from. Now, iniquity being the worst of this, in this gradation, iniquity is knowingly self-identified with sin. So it's not just simply a sinner who may stray over into crime, right? And then rationalize it. But somebody who enjoys this, they're sadistic, there's malice, there's conscious malice. And we think of this in terms of first degree murder, second degree murder is premeditated crime. And now here, I think we see that St. Augustine's right by calling, by saying this is where unreality comes in. That it's not, you can't, there's no reality to conscious sin. The person is basically denying reality and they are becoming unreal. They're suicidal. You can say it's cosmic suicide. The iniquitous behavior is what we would assign to the demonic. So the notion of genocide is iniquitous because it's knowingly done and it's premeditated. Something like starting a war is sinful because it's a deliberate rebellion against, the just basic values of Western civilization, and you find some way to justify it, which is non-rational, which is clearly doesn't really add up. Going back up to the level of evil again here, let's look at that a little bit more. People doing evil can be seen as simply reckless, lazy, tired, undisciplined, confused, haven't done their homework about morality, and they're reckless for that reason, not because they consciously want to hurt people. People are committing errors, I think you can see at this point that this is not intended, but it does open the door to something worse. And again, let's look at accidents. Accidents, we need very importantly to distinguish accidents from everything else on the chart. So I think that covers everything now, and I'll get us out of that and ask you to make any comments, and we can maybe hopefully talk about some practical applications of these ideas. For example, how would you regard the notion of loving your enemy who's a perpetrator of sin, and loving the person who's injured you or your family? How can you love such a person, and what does that mean, practically speaking, about the reality of evil? And how do we understand theologically that command?
Let me ask you, Byron, in your book, your presentation is very heady and very almost scholastic in making distinctions and so on. In your book, are you going to move to this level of questions of the relevance of these categories for life and for dealing with relationships? In other words, are you going to make this has your book been conceived, and when it comes out, will it be a kind of practical theology as well as a theoretical? Your presentation was very theoretical, and this question that you're asking is now a very practical question.
This is my challenge, Roger, as I revise the thesis to come up with these. And you can see I haven't done that much with it, and I want to do that, and yet I'm looking to practical theologians to advise. I just got done reading a book that does do practical theology, which basically says, and which I will incorporate in my thinking, which is that there really isn't evil in the sense of the other guy is evil and I'm not. Any notion of assigning evil to the other and goodness to yourself is evil. So this is a foundational notion that I see right now. And in order to apply practically a theodicy should support us in understanding that we are all one in these problems. We're all perpetrators in some area of our life, and we are working this out as the body of Christ. And we must never project or assign evil to the other person if we don't see it in our own heart. But I don't think I have a full answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to build another set of categories into the 6 that you have, or 5, from accident to, through to deliberate, deliberate evil, whether or not these understandings and location generate different practices, whether or not they generate different kind of behavior patterns logically from other understandings. Or you're going through the classic models for the explanation of evil and then coming up to the modern evolutionary, and where you're finally process theologians thinking of themselves as partners with God, whether or not all of those models generate different behavior patterns or understandings of one's behavior.
Yeah, some are pretty straightforward and should lend themselves to a practical discussion. Certainly the process view does, because at least if we look at David Ray Griffin, who is the chief theorist, I guess, in that category, in that field. Griffin and many process theologians are activists. They're political activists, and I think it generates that practice more than any other Christian theodicy. And Griffin in particular is spent the last 10 years of his life writing books about 9/11 and climate change, saying our understanding of evil commands us to get engaged politically. So that's clearly a practice that we get from that. It's not necessarily a practice we get from the notion that evil is unreal, according to St. Augustine, and that the practice, say, of a conservative Christian is simply to make sure the soul has been saved. So that the practice becomes really pastoral, which is to convert the person to a belief in Christ and to the sacraments, so that we know that at least they have been released from the stain of original sin through grace. So there's your practice.
Yeah.
Now, moving to the beyond that, to the practice of loving your enemy, I'd like to kind of put that out to everyone here again and see if anyone would like to address that in light of what we've said.
I'm actually curious to know your thoughts on sort of flipping the verbiage of how you described it when you spoke to sort of a moral admonition against seeing evil in others. I'm wondering how you feel about seeing others in evil, in the sense of being captive to evil and being overpowered. That's, someone just brought up in a family whose ethic is just dominated by bigotry and hatred and so on. Does that change it for you? Or just put it in another category that deserves another discussion, maybe?
I think that The issue here is we're labeling and assigning these moral categories to other people as something we don't also have in us in potential and actual. So there's the issue of shadow work, which is a very important practice, which I'm now researching, so that when we assign that to anybody outside of the rule of law, right? In other words, a rule of law, there's the groups or the state's power to assign evil intentions to a perpetrator. That could be reserved only to the state or to the group, to group justice, the group, according to laws that are known to the community. But for you to make that law and kind of apply that to another person is fraught with possibility of evil on your part. So when, I just happened to have practiced something. I was kind of, in a way, desperate because a friend of mine has really been causing a lot of issues, and I was assigning evil to this person. And I found the Hawaiian practice called Ho'oponopono. I think that's how you say it, which is to not assign this to the person, but rather to ask their soul to forgive you because you live in a universe in which you assign evil to them or in which evil exists at all. Because it's all one. So this is a non-dual view that we're all in this together. There's one mind, and your contribution is simply to ask for forgiveness for everyone and for yourself. And I must tell you, I had an almost instant result of a kind of blessing. So that's one way to address your question. It's unbelievably complicated.
Yeah, I guess that was sort of a beautiful paraphrasing and illustration of what I was talking about, but it would take us a long time to establish the connective tissue of how they resembled one another.
Almost all the nations of the world have engaged in iniquitous activity, warfare. It's endemic in the human population. Murder is pervasive in the human population. Theft is pervasive. All these things, and corruption is everywhere. And almost anybody can fall into corrupt practices. So I think that the practical application of this is suggested by Jesus, which is working on yourself, seeing the log in your eye, not the speck in the other eye. I mean, can be converted to various practices, but especially I'd say the notion of shadow work, which is always coming back to yourself and your assignment of evil to others, and leaving when someone is breaking laws, you are not the one who is the prosecutor. You do not have the right to judge them. So the judgment that we just automatically seem to do is actually breaking moral law, which is to make yourself the one in the light and the other not, when it's truly can't be said. Even the greatest saints. I mean, Martin Luther King. You can think of others, that were engaged in some, unsavory activity. There's no exception except with the possible exception of Jesus, Buddha, a few of the greatest teachers of humankind. So there really is no reason not to engage in this practice of what I call shadow work. But what is the method of that work? We have a variety of Christian methods of self-examination. And that's a huge discussion. Does anybody want to contribute anything on that topic of self-examination?
Well, for Lent, the Jesus prayer is perfect. So every spring I become a Byzantine Christian again. And I find that the Jesus prayer is the perfect expression of my own sinfulness, asking for a mercy upon me, a sinner. So the rest of the year, of course, we could focus on our evolution and those aspects, but what you call this shadow implementation seems quite appropriate as a lead into Easter.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, that's just right. That's excellent. And we ask for mercy in the Jesus prayer for ourselves. We also ask for have mercy on everyone. And that's our way of saying, I forgive everyone. I forgive everyone through Jesus, through Christ. So this forgiveness is our prayer. Now, I find a huge, not huge, but a real problem with the issue of forgiveness when there's been a very deep perpetration by another toward oneself. What about preliminaries to forgiveness? Is there a preliminary to that? Is there something that must be done prior to that? For example, do we need to seek out a sort of fairness in sorting out the issues before we forgive somebody? Because we have a problem here, which is, are we prematurely forgiving them in such a way that will not lead to correction? If they really are a perpetrator, will the forgiveness just enable them? So I think that, in this practice of the Jesus prayer, is there something else that we need to be looking at in terms of practical application within a community, for example? If there's been in a church, if there's been sinful behavior by one person toward another, Jesus has what I call the three-step method. I think it's Matthew 25. That you go to the alleged sinner and ask them and tell them what sin you think they've done toward you. And if they don't hear you, you come back with a witness. And if that doesn't work, then you take them to the congregation. And that makes sense in terms of, I think, what I said before, which is that you cannot be the judge. You can ask the person to forgive. You can offer forgiveness and ask them to acknowledge the so-called sin, but it's really up to the group to dispense justice. And Jesus says they can be cast out of the congregation, and that's sort of the application of law, the rule of law in a church. So we have that in politics. We have the rule of law in the state. But we have the same thing in the church, but we find in churches, this is very hard to apply because we don't have these distinctions down clear in my church experience. What people do instead is they resort to gossip. Now, gossip may have a moral, I think it was Martin Marty who wrote an essay I never forgot, that we need gossip, he said, because this is how we find out about the range of things people can do and do actually do, so that we can grow in an understanding of morality. And if nobody ever gossiped, we wouldn't have that much insight about moral issues. But there's a limit to how much we should gossip, he said. But what is the limit? And how much is gossip is this issue of projection. and how much of gossip is really something that we should stop and just do our own inner work on our shop. So, these are huge issues. I want to say a bit more about soul making and the practices that go with that. It's really, I think for me, the notion of forgiving yourself, because you have an eternal life in which to work through your issues, and and it's also soul making allows you to feel better about the perpetrations toward you, because these perpetrations have permitted you to, through your suffering, to see how things work in this universe. And you now can choose a better way by seeing what others have done to themselves, to you, to the community. And you grow through the decision-making process that happens in your suffering. And so we're at a very slow evolution that is designed for reflection, for contemplation, and then improved insight. So this improvement in insight is something that's highly valued by the intelligent design, or whatever you want to call that, because it gives us the freedom to choose and to grow. The downside of soul making is this sense that it's inevitable that we're going to grow out of this, because God is behind the scenes making it happen, not letting it happen, but catalyzing our perfection over eons of time. But what if we take the view that God doesn't have that much power? God is not all powerful. And much of it is on our hands. For example, the notion, if you read David Ray Griffin, which I do a lot, Griffin really thinks we may not make it. We may destroy the planet and the experiment's over. God is not powerful enough. God is loving enough to save us, you might say, but is not powerful enough. So if you have that view that God is not all powerful, that all the other thinkers have, then you got to go out there and get active. So again, the practical application is the church has to do what you see some of these churches doing. Even Union Theological Seminary, in a way, is becoming like a political activist center of activity. It seems to be on a weekly basis, there's some huge political event or call, speaker. It's quite politicized. Within that is yet another practice. And this is the issue of polarization for those who are activists. Let's see, there's another evil that comes up in being an activist, where you're assigning to the other side things that aren't really true. And you're taking the point of view of the left and missing out on what the right believes. And I saw that because I happened to have been at the January 6th event in the Capitol, because I live near DC now. So I went as a journalist, and I've never been in a Trump event, believe me. And I came out of the subway right in the middle of it. And when I was with a friend, and it was a little scary for us. We got to the Capitol a little bit late, and it seemed like there were 250,000 people. It's one of the biggest events I've ever seen, much bigger than has been represented. And what I learned by talking to people is that these were seemingly good people, not the people that went inside, but the people on the outside, the far right. A lot of them were just, mom and dad and, sort of good, patriots that have a narrow view of things. And I really had a kind of a conversion or a change, not to the alt-right or anything, but they have a point of view that has validity that needs to be heard. And the left has not listened. And I think there's something evil in the way the left has projected upon these people, and even Trump himself. And it's projection, not all of it, but a lot of it. So we have yet another application here in politics, and it's a grim situation because of that, because of lack of what I would call a transpartisan. We need both left and right to be in dialogue. Let me give another example, which is the example of lockdowns. There's this predominant view that a lockdown is for the good. But I think that there's a lack of, that's verging on error and evil, using my categories, in that people doing the lockdowns are not looking at the long-term effects. But the studies are showing again and again that the long-term effects of locking people down, including children, especially children, are somewhat worse than the infection and the growth of the pandemic. Once you get to know that, and I've looked at that pretty extensively, we're finding that there is something evil converging on possible sin on the part of politicians, because they're not looking at the research, and they're getting invested in what is turning out to be a perpetration. So anyway, I had to get that one in. I guess we might conclude on a little bit more positive note, which is that to the extent that you have a series of steps in our understanding of evil, the other side of that coin, so to speak, is steps in the ascension toward goodness. So that if we think in evolutionary terms, we look in both directions, and we get more subtle in these distinctions. Which is why I get heady with this, because I spent a lifetime looking at these issues, and I just don't think we're getting very far. And we need a model that we can work with, that shows, that depicts evolution, but on the one hand, but also exonerates God. So, I mean, I think the last of the practices is maybe a practice that justifies God's love and grace and power for us in our hearts. How is this that this God has supposedly in eternity has permitted horrendous evils?
Mm-hmm.
How can we continue to love that God? How can we love our Creator? What is the practical pastoral, how do you deal with people in your congregation who can't envision the goodness of God because of the evil they see? And so I think one of the ways to do that is to have this kind of multiverse view, that there's an evolutionary realm and there's sort of evolving deity in that realm. And there's an absolute realm, an eternal realm, where there's eternal deity in that realm. So it's a kind of a process view, but I would modify that. Process theology sort of says there is a multiverse. But I would go further to say there's like two different dimensions where there's connection between the eternal and the evolutional at points. So when we have the incarnation of Christ, that's an intervention from the eternal realm. But we don't have Christ intervening and incarnating all the time. We have just occasional interventions. So Christ comes and kind of changes the rules by showing up from this eternal realm, and then exits. And so that can we love a God who comes, sees all this, and then exits? And well, what's the point of coming in and then exiting and leaving us with, the Roman Empire, etc.? Well, why would a loving God do that? And of course, we have the cross. And why did God submit to the evil of this world in the cross? And, the ultimate practical upshot of that is that God is in this with us every step of the way. And the cross is there at every moment. There is a kind of crucifixion of the self. And that God allows this free will so that we can sort of walk with our own cross to reduce our self-centeredness and turn to the other and in love and discover love the way, the sort of the natural way, really, the evolutional way, which is we have the ability to find the good in each step. And Jesus pointed us toward that. And so the theology has to allow for all these dimensions to work. If you collapse one into the other, we don't get it. If we're just in this eternal realm and God is doing everything, it doesn't work. Or if we're in this just secular evolutionary realm, it doesn't work. So we need both, and we need to show where they meet and where they don't meet, and where the freedom is and where the grace is. Thanks for that question, Roger. I think you've definitely helped me to work through the practice.
We used for a presentation that took the highly theoretical and showed its implications for both community life and personal life in dealing with the world, everyday life. So,
Well,
Yes, go ahead,
I
please.
think we're out of time, Byron. We went over, but it was heady, like Roger said, but it was good. Gave me a lot to think about. More questions.
I've got a list of questions that's endless, so we're together in that.
Yeah.
I guess maybe we can end. I think that ultimately this is mysterious, and it's just a lot of questions that we park at the feet of God and ask for answers. So may you all do so and get answers,
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your preparation.
everybody.
I really appreciate it. And I think everybody here appreciates it too, your work.
Thank
What
you.
is the title? What will your book be called?
Probably be called Integral Theodicy, or
Oh.
Meta Theodicy is another possible title.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thanks, Byron. Good to see you.
Friends. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
God bless.
God bless.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks again.
Byron, thank you so much. Do you have a copy of the talk?
Of the video?
Well, not the video,
Oh,
your talk,
sure.
what you said.
Yeah, I'll send
Yeah.
you that. Yeah, it's a.
Yeah, because I'd like to, there's so many questions, yeah, especially, Jesus came and he saw the mess we were in and he left.
Yeah.
If you really think about it, the application from a spiritual thing is always grace. It's always grace. Grace has the power to change things. But, as you were talking, I was thinking about Trump, because more people have used the word evil connected with him than I've ever heard used before.
Well, I think that's in a way a reason why I did all this, because I just couldn't take it anymore. Because I could see that I've been in the left my whole life, and the left is also evil.
They are. I agree with you.
I thought
I agree.
Hillary Clinton was not really that good of a person, Bill Clinton was, I learned some things about Clinton that most people don't know. He was really a dark person in a lot of ways. So
He had a big shadow side,
huge.
Bill Clinton.
Hillary.
Talented man, smart man, but had a big shadow side.
So it's on both sides, and that's really the big theme. And it kind of drove me crazy my whole life looking at this. It's like I got to figure this out, but it's interesting to have Roger say that I was heady.
I thought that was very funny too,
kind of,
because we did in the small worship group that I'm a part of, we did his book.
yeah.
Talk about heady.
Yeah, he's really pretty heady too. So it takes one to know one.
I would call it transference.
But it got me motivated to
Bring it down a notch.
break it down, and I'm glad for that. So he and I both were University of Chicago graduates, and that's a very heady place.
Oh.
Yeah.
So do you think Trump is evil?
I think Trump is evil and sinful.
I do too.
But he also has this goodness that I've now seen, because I've been studying ever since I met Trump people. I'm like, what's the attraction? All these people totally deluded. They're not. There's something they're talking about that the left doesn't see.
Well, what is the goodness in Trump? I look for it and I don't see it.
It's the love. It's the putting himself in the place of the working man, to the extent that he understands their dilemma. He's not just a demagogue. Okay, I think he really, in his heart, gets their problem, which is mainly economic.
I don't think he gives a damn.
I think that's the issue, because the left says he doesn't give a damn, but the right says, hey, look, man, we got really good jobs. Unemployment rate's down to 4%. We're not sending people into foreign wars. He did not start a war.
That's true.
He pulled people out of the Middle East. He's the first president in my lifetime that didn't start a war. And think about that. And he spoke the language of ordinary people that the left used to speak and doesn't. He opposed the excesses of of political correctness, which
That's right. That was a good thing.
That is a big deal. And the more I talk to these people, a few of the people I grew up with who were Trump, they said, look, this is getting ridiculous. One guy, a friend of mine, his son is getting a sex change. He's like 19. It doesn't make any sense. And it's because of political correctness. And it's like, and it's gone so far that it's wrecking our culture. So Trump is part of that pushback.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you verbalizing this. One of the things you said I couldn't agree more with was we have to listen to the right, because there are good, articulate people on the right. And the problem with the right is it's been connected so much with Trump, who's such a royal lies and makes his own reality and all of that. It's if the right would only get rid of him and just, I could listen to them more, but when they connect with him, it's so hard, because this man is ill. He's ill. He's ill. He actually, I don't know if he knows he's lying or he just creates this world of his. He's ill.
Yeah, I mean,
we're all a little ill. I agree with that.
I think it's more that he's a little bit more ill than maybe you and me or something, but we're all ill. I mean, that's really the lesson that I draw, is that.
Yeah, but we know it. He doesn't know it. Maybe he does.
Maybe his wife tells him, and he just, has this kind of notion that you push forward despite your weaknesses to make things happen, and let it roll, so to speak. And so he creates value in real estate, while he also creates destruction. But he did create a lot of value.
In real estate, you're talking?
Yeah. He created a lot of value. He created some incredible things: golf courses, buildings, Mar-a-Lago. That's not nothing. And if something went wrong, then you sue him.
Well, you know that he turned over his income tax. This was today or yesterday.
Oh, he
The
did?
court demanded, yeah,
Oh, wow.
that's going to be very interesting.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a big deal. But,
Yeah.
there you have it. I mean, so, but inside the Trump world is this notion that the great evil of the left is overwhelming as well. And so you have this awful situation of both sides saying the other side is evil.
Hmm.
And equally so. I mean, I've been going to their websites and looking at their videos as a study in evil, And man, you think we think he's evil? They think we're evil.
That's pretty sad. How's Catherine, by the way?
I
Getting
think good. I think she's
good.
but she can't find work. And that's horrific. And
So
that's
what does she do for money?
she's borrowing
Oh,
from
wow.
various friends, and she's living on food stamps, and she hasn't paid rent for 12 months. So
That's pretty tragic. That's a tragedy, a woman like that.
yeah,
Really.
I keep in close touch. I think that she's going to make it, but I don't know how.
Mm.
Yeah. And I as you said once, I mean, I give her hope, and that's what I do.
You do, and that's a wonderful thing. That's a
Well,
really wonderful thing.
I mean, we had a very good early kind of affair, and I have a lot of affection, but it's no longer sexual, but I think I get it. I mean, she's a victim of injustice. It's huge.
Mm.
And there's a few of us that are rallying to her support.
Wow.
So, keep her in your prayers.
When you talk to her, tell her I send her my best, really.
I will, Fran.
She's a good woman. She really is. I just, it's sad. It's sad for me to see this happen to anybody.
Well, I think she's an illustration of the injustice that we have, and sometimes it just focuses on one person like you can't believe it. So, but she'll make it.
I think you're right.
You've said she's a survivor.
So you don't come to New York anymore, Byron?
A tiny bit, but
She is a survivor.
Yeah, you pointed that out. That was right. She's just fine. I mean, she's just not paying her rent.
It probably bothers you more than it bothers her.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
I just can't believe anybody can live like that and just still laugh and be joyous, which she is.
And it's kind of an acceptance of an embrace of her situation rather than pushing back on it. You embrace it, and you kind of say, this is part of the deal. I don't like it, but part of the
She doesn't
deal.
like it, and she accepts it, but deep down she suffers too deeply, and the suffering then makes you can pick it up. If you're interviewing her for a job, for example, you're going to pick up something is the
It's a
suffering.
myth. Yeah.
The suffering, that this is a person that is not fulfilled.
You think she will go home? leave this country?
I'm
No?
I'm trying, I suggested that she get involved in a business with Russians.
I
where-
remember you said that.
Yeah, she go back and forth and
You were gonna go in business with,
we had an idea, and it's still under consideration, which my own books and publications need to be translated into Russian. And I said I wouldn't pay you to do that. You'd have to find a market in Russia, and then I might pay her.
Hmm.
She could
but
fund-
is she gonna do it?
well, she needs
Yeah.
funding to get over there. Yeah, so we don't have any funding, and I don't have funding for her to go over there.
Hmm.
So that we're looking for funding, somebody even in Russia that she knows that she's trained in market research at Columbia. So she can do that and come back with, and then she would run it. Actually run it.
Does she have a good business head, Byron?
Well, she has an economics master's degree. So it's kind of heady like me, but I don't know. Actually, I don't know if she has that ability to run a business.
Yeah, that takes a little talent. You know who has a good business head? Charlene, the woman who is working in Union. She is a big asset, and I think part of her talent is that she doesn't have an MDiv
Oh,
at all.
good.
Her talent is business, I don't know, something in business, and she's so effective at Union.
Oh,
What a find. I mean, I don't know who hired her, but she's a find. She gets things done. She's always on this up. She always has a positive attitude. She's a find.
I think it was a good idea to have something like what I did today. And I don't know if there's an email. I guess I don't get those emails. Yes, I do. Yeah, that's in the Student Digest. So maybe I'll see you on another one of these.
Yeah, I have one, I have two more planned. One with an African, he really is an African American, on his discovery of a new religion. So his journey. And the third one is very practical. A woman I know who is a parish nurse. From a practical point of view, how effective what she does. And there are a lot of, I would imagine, there must be some nurses in Union who are wondering what to do. So there's more than just chaplaincy.
Yeah, there's health and medicine
Yeah,
in
so
relation.
those are the two more. So I'm going to talk to them again and see when they're free and set up another one, because this is nice and informal. I don't have to write papers and papers about who's coming, and that's what I like about it. So,
Okay.
but
I'll look for-
thank you for being the first person. You were the premier.
And we had a few people. I think we had a decent discussion and a few people.
I think you did too. Yeah. And I'm anxious to see what my friend Jerry, she's very, very intelligent. So I'm anxious to see, where she falls with this. We'll talk about it, but if you could send me some notes, that would help me. And I was thinking the next time, whoever talks to get the question rolling, have a plan. Either give me the question they want me to ask just to start it. And then,
Yeah, that's better for you as the host to set the tone.
yeah,
It's better. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
but we'll work on that.
do it.
But Byron, thank you. I wish you keep me posted on your book and all that you're doing. And also Catherine, I worry about her too.
Thank you, and I will. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.